Hello and welcome to the Divorce TV show live stream. And I've got a guest here today who's what I call the right kind of lawyer, Henry Crisp. Henry is a mediator, qualified as a mediator, also a collaborative lawyer, and one of those lawyers who genuinely would prefer to keep you out of court. So welcome, Henry. Great to see you here, and thank you for making the time to be here today. We've got lots of really interesting things to discuss. The first one I would like to start with is you have quite a lot of knowledge about assisted reproduction and artificial insemination relating to divorce. And obviously this is something that I'm guessing is growing. Perhaps tell us a little bit about the landscape and why are you involved in this even in the first place?
Well, no, thank you. And thank you for inviting me on. So this is a growing area. And I think there's a couple of reasons for it, really. It's obviously accommodates alternative family structures. And also, if I look at most of my clients, probably the highest number for assisted reproduction would be lesbian couples who want to have a child, and they go through the conception process. And so there is a sort of a framework of law around that, which is sort of 2008 based, which tries to categorize their status as parents and what their responsibilities are, and navigate the very tricky area of the donor, who should have parental responsibility, what the financial obligations are, and actually more mundane stuff like does the child see the donor, or is that not intended? And so it's growing because I think people are wanting greater choice in what their family looks like, how it's composed, and of course as we become more liberal, different family structures are more accepted and acceptable, and it accommodates a whole range of needs in that area. So you've got different things all wrapped up here. You've got the kind of assisted reproduction, which is actually more often than not something that happens at home via Amazon. It's a very sort of the particularly in the gay and lesbian community, it's a very sort of organic, sort of homespun sort of solution. But we'll come back to that because that's quite important. And then you've got the much more technical side of things, which is either the clinic assisted reproduction, AR or AI, artificial insemination, that side of things, or of course surrogacy, which is a fascinating subject, which involves potentially non-genetically related material in the form of embryo donation, or now embryos that are constituted of gametes from two different people, or even, as you've probably read in paper 3. Sorry, Susie.
No, don't apologise. I just wanted to butt in there because I was thinking about this the other day. So could you have a mother who has a child, and then but the child is not the mother's egg, it's a donated egg and a sperm. So effectively the birth mother is not genetically tied to the child.
Yes, you can. In fact, you can and you do. I think what's really interesting, there's, and I don't know how many of your viewers, listeners would be aware of this, but the Law Commission, which is the body that's sort of charged with modernising the law, or sort of trying to keep in step with some of these developments, has been looking at this area. In fact, was supposed to, I think, to have produced its report by now, and has produced some very broad recommendations to try and govern exactly those type of points, and to try and bring the law into some kind of workable modern framework. But I have to say it's really struggling, and the recommendations that I've read, the so-called key recommendations, are very broad and not very helpful. They're sort of aspirational, you might say. but trying to set a sort of a path. But I mean, it's worth remembering that it relatively recently became legal, and when it first became legal, it was heterosexual only, and then was sort of updated. But there's a lot of questions, and
and do people need to? I mean, obviously, it would seem logical that, because of those complexities, that people would sit down and have some form of agreement. Is that what happens in practice, or do they just sort of dive ahead?
Well, yeah. Again, it's a really good question. So, one of the problems when you've got a sort of a bit of a legal vacuum is that people will find their own solutions, and commonly that is to go to jurisdictions where they can get greater purchase, greater certainty on the transaction. Now, and of course, actually interestingly, as you probably saw in the news, all of us saw that there were a lot of those cases in the Ukraine. Ukraine was one of those jurisdictions that people used a lot. And the fact there were babies born to surrogates unclaimed as a result of the war. So that gives you an idea of the scale of these things. But anyway, so the problem with the law, I mean, this is a very broad statement, is that it's very good at saying what it isn't. So essentially, it's defining it, in the alternative. So the law as it stands only allows for, it does allow for surrogacy, but only so-called altruistic surrogacy. And we'll come back to that because that's a fascinating and probably inaccurate term. The surrogacy agreement is something that lawyers cannot have anything to do with. So, and then what happens is you have what's called parental orders that come after the child has been born. And the parental orders are the bit that sorts out the kind of the parentage, officially, you might say, at that point. But one of the things the Law Commission is looking at is, first of all, regulating the non-commerciality of surrogacy. So when I say altruistic, people do get paid, but they get paid expenses. But I'm not aware of any cases where the court have ultimately ruled expenses inappropriate. So expenses can be quite loaded. So I'm not saying it's a vehicle to get around things, but perhaps people are being a little bit generous to try and offset some of the obvious problems that surrogates have. But the other issue is the timing of the parental order comes at the end, comes after. In fact, comes a little bit after, because there's a short period of time after birth when it's deemed inappropriate to get the document signed because of perhaps hormonal changes in the birth mother. So, but it does, of course, then create extraordinary uncertainty, and that uncertainty relates to the lack of a governing agreement, a lack of certainty over the commerciality, the nature of the transaction, and then a problem that, well, what if you've gone through the whole thing and the mother changes her mind or changes the terms?
So I find that quite amazing, because that last point you've made, but is kind of the obvious one you think of. So if people are, if let's say 3 people have decided to do this, and they create, maybe I would always advise use a trained mediator to discuss all the outcomes. Don't try and do it around the kitchen table, or it might never happen. And then, but once you've got that agreement, like if you do that as part of a divorce financial settlement, you would then get that turned into a legally binding agreement. So are you saying that they can't make it a legally binding agreement prior to actually embarking on this?
In this jurisdiction, that's right. You have this sort of loose arrangement, really, which is then sorted out at the end of the process with the parental order.
That's insane, isn't it? Because that alone means that inevitably there's going to be the potential for years of strife and trauma and costs, with people arguing later.
Well, I think the reason why the Law Commission have kind of bounced off this subject, if you like, I mean, they haven't, they're still working on it, but the reason why we don't have probably what we need is because at the heart of surrogacy lies some issues which are fundamental to the way, as a society, we define ourselves. And it's funny, you sort through the detail, but you very quickly hit shifts in thinking that would be unpalatable politically. And I think that, in this particular case, you've got two fundamental belief systems coming into conflict. The first is obviously the religious. What is a birth, and what are the obligations of a parent? And it's trite to observe that all the religions that I can think of have some pretty strong views on that, and therefore the communities will reflect them. And here, the kind of Judeo-Christian tradition is no exception, and our law, references that. In its history.
Ironic, though, a little bit because of the Mary and Immaculate Conception concept. It's a little bit of hypocrisy there, don't you think?
Yeah, that's very good. So what you're saying is the first surrogacy was sanctioned.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
But I think that's really interesting what you're saying about the social construct, because do you think that's why it took so long to get no-fault divorce, which it was forever, because it wasn't the lawyers holding that back, was it? It was the government's fear of upsetting the Daily Mail. I was told by one person, and also right. And that also brings us on to LGBT. Married. Finally, they're allowed to get married, but it took long enough to get civil partnerships. Do you think that what people have to understand, it's not just that the law is a sort of fuddy-duddy people who are very slow to act, is that they're up against major social implications for what they do?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, and I think it's incredibly well observed to link that with the no-fault divorce, because that was something that the government did legislate for decades ago, actually. And they shelved those provisions. They shelved them primarily because some of the government at the time, some elements in the government at the time, really felt that it was going too far in terms of traditional core values. And it's such an interesting thing, isn't it, where the law meets society, and what is the answer? Because society is obviously made up of different. You just look at you've got the religious voice, the secular voice, but you've got the progressives and the traditionalists. You've got every different groupings, and ultimately you've got to try and find something which is a consensus. And in that particular case, it was felt that it was going too far. And I'm sure, not sure actually, I liked the sound of what you said about the Daily Mail, but I've actually no information on that at all, but it sounds about right to me. But yes, and of course, with surrogacy, you've got, and I have some sympathy for them, Susie, on this, because I have to say, I don't know what the answer is either, because, I think at first blush, your reaction was certainly the same as mine, and that's, this needs to be ironed out. There must be a process, a civilized, humane process that sort of avoids that uncertainty at the end, or that uncertainty even during the process of it. The problem is you very quickly meet the kind of Handmaid's Tale type of situation, womb for rent, which is highly objectionable to people on the more liberal end, or progressive liberal, who understandably don't want to commoditize the female body in that way. And of course, the moment you become transactional, the moment you turn it into a market, the moment you have what all markets want, and that's contractual enforceability, reliability, certainty, then there's a cost, and that cost comes in the fact that you're locking someone into a transaction which is very personal. So that's on the one side of things, and that tends to be more of a kind of in terms of the disposition of Europe, that's more of a Northern European take, and in the Southern Europe, you tend to have more of a religious objection to to the sort of, this is no way to regard the miracle of birth. So I mean, you can see them trying to sort that out, and in the meantime, though, what you have is you have people shopping abroad.
Yeah. So
And I
they'll
find that,
always go and find what they want. And I think
yeah,
for those who are thinking, well, this is nothing to do with me. I think I just like to bring this discussion because I think you're absolutely right that it's a societal issue. It's not just about the law and what they're struggling with. So when people are going through a divorce, I find this, and I'm sure you do as well, that they have assumptions about the legal system. So they're very quick to blame lawyers if things don't work out. And even I'm explaining to them, well, hang on, they're part of what is actually a very toxic family law system.
it is.
And of course, that toxic family law system was toxic for longer than it needed to be. I mean, it still has many issues, but
Yes,
getting
many.
rid of having no fault divorce definitely was a step in the right direction. But that wasn't the law slowing that down. That was governments and society. So the answer, I think, is that you can try to make these things work, but you're never probably going to fully succeed. So the answer to me is quite simple, is that individuals need to take responsibility for that process themselves and use the law
Yes.
to kind of qualify that. So, for example, you're getting a divorce, you discuss the finances with your mediator, you turn that into a legally binding consent order. However, I believe that that's not how it works when you are in the situation. You could sit down as a couple with your surrogate, you could discuss it with a mediator, you come through all the different options, you could write it all up beautifully. But am I right in thinking that you cannot make that legally binding prior to the birth of the child?
Yeah, in terms of the end outcome of having a child, having your child through the process of surrogacy, that requires the parental order at the end, and that is difficult. But I would, as I said, I do understand some of the reasons for that difficulty. But I think it's, I mean, I know this is broadening it out and probably more political than we'd like, and I say this coming from no particular angle, but I think it's the same sort of problem we face in the displacement you see in the healthcare sort of sector, where we seem to have a moral ambiguity when it comes to taking nurses from certain countries, and we have the same moral ambiguity when it comes to surrogacy abroad in many ways. And I think that tells you that there's something wrong and something needs addressing. And so I think whatever the future of surrogacy is, I think there's a real need for it. Fertility rates are dropping, birth rates are dropping. We're entering into sort of problems that society are going to have to deal with on an economic basis. They've got to fix this, and sometimes you've just got to fix it, and then, it won't be perfect, but just get on with it and do something. But so you're absolutely right. About that, and I just want to pick up a little bit also on you mentioned the toxic system in the broader sense, and I want to echo that because I think that is a part of the same problem actually. The family courts, the family law in its broadest sense should be a service industry, or should be akin to a service industry. And I think I understand why. And of course, it would be naive to say that we don't have genuinely intractable, complex disputes. I've dealt with international child abduction cases, so I know that there are cases where you have to have recourse to something which is external and frightening and theatrical. But generally speaking, I don't think the adversarial system that we have for day-to-day divorces and worse still, children, serves us well. I think it's too expensive, so it's underfunded, the huge delays. I think honestly, I think the quality of the product is poor if you're putting it in commercial
I think
terms.
what upsets me most when I'm described to people, peace, something I talked about in my TEDx, you need boundaries with peace. You can't. It's a very strong position to want to take responsibility and be and finding a better way to do something. But if you boundary of the law is that you say I want to I want you to provide the financial information so we can have a proper discussion about that, and then you have to get a court order to get them to do it, but that takes ages, costs you money and time, and then they just ignore it. And then you've got to get another court order to tell them to obey that court order. For me,
honestly, trying to explain to people,
it all falls apart, because it's like having the bouncer on the door who just runs away as soon as anyone turns up in
that's a very good analogy, because that's exactly what it's like. Because you take your clients through, as I say, the theatre of court, which is very old-fashioned, really. I know we don't wear cloaks and wigs, although some of us would like to introduce the wig. They essentially, you then get the order, particularly in children. I mean, perhaps specifically in children, to find that it's really not worth the paper it's written on in many cases. It's because the problem fundamentally, I think, is one of delay. It's innate in some areas of justice that it has to be delivered swiftly if it is to be delivered at all. And if at the moment you delay, because it's focused from the child's welfare point of view, they settle into a regime, they settle into social norms, all of those things. The court then come back to it 6-12 months later, trying to fix the breach, to find that everything's moved, all the pieces have moved. And it becomes an almost intractable problem. So the first thing I think I would change is speed. It has to be, in certain areas, it has to be something which, if it's going to be done at all, it needs to be done quickly. Otherwise, I do think everyone's wasting their time and money to a great extent.
And encourages people to abduct a child and to leave the country. Unfortunately, you, in some cases, that I hate to say this, but for their point of view, might seem the best option. I have to say, I find child abduction horrific, not just because of, I was at a father's meeting about this recently, and what's most disturbing is, as you say, everything takes so long. And even when the parent who's had the child abducted from them does all the right things and actually is legally in the right, if the other country, maybe Germany, for example, or any other country, can just not enforce it. So it's internationally, we've got a lack of discussion around this. So I always like to be solution focused. So I still think it is worth for everyone to sit down, ideally with a trained mediator or and talk things through, which is why prenups are so important, but in a different context to just the law. So I teased you earlier, said I'd love to say something about that, and I think this is a good time to do it. My vision is that if you're going to get married or have children in a more sort of complex, extended family way, whatever it is, you do need to be able to talk about money. Because I didn't do this. I was frightened to talk about money, and I paid a high price for that. And because people go, it's not romantic, but it's not romantic. The outflow, and also if you can't talk about money and the future, you're going to spend in a relationship in one way or another with these people for the rest of your life. So you should be able to do that. So I believe people should have a life plan. So you talk about all the sort of life, maybe even work with a life coach to talk about the future, where you're going to retire, all the beautiful things. And then you have two what ifs. One of them is, what if one of us dies? Well, people don't have a problem having a will, do they? And then I have terrible number skills, so I don't know if the statistic is true, but I'm sure it might not be far off. I worked out once you're about 7 times more likely to leave your relationship alive than dead. So, if you think about it, most people get divorced, they don't die. So
yeah, I think.
why would you not have an agreement like
Yeah,
a will? Because what if one of us ends up in a
yeah,
having a nervous breakdown and there's mental illness, addiction? There's lots of reasons that relationships end. It's not something you can actually control.
yeah,
Which I
yeah.
think is a big misconception of people
I
often think, oh, I can control this. So yeah, your thoughts on that I'd really
Oh
appreciate.
yes, yeah. Well, it's an interesting area. So prenups are. Let's just look at that first of all, because there's so I draft these things, and there's a lot of confusion. But it's quite straightforward. Prenups are not legally binding. Full stop. What they are is they're highly informative. So what we're looking at, that's a Rad McIntyre case where, which was not actually the original case. A lot of cases have looked at this over the years and tried to give agency to couples to make decisions about their future. And the direction of travel is very much towards, giving people the ability to determine what should happen. So that's the first thing. And in many countries, they have prenups that you have to sign, one way or the other. You tick a box, joint property, not joint property. It's very common in Europe. Just like South Africa have it. It's common. We don't have it. So the Law Commission, again, is a venerable institution, are pondering this. But in the meantime, everyone's trying to work out what to do. So I think they're a very good idea, just on the basis of your comment, Susie, and that is couples go into marriage. I mean, the whole thing, the first thing that you get hit when you're getting married is the kind of right, where's it going to be? What's the venue going to be? Who's invited? What's it going to look like? Dresses, bridesmaids, the whole thing is a massive sort of theatrical expression of romance and that sort of thing. So there's no space, and people hate talking about prenups when they're getting married. They often say exactly what you said. Well, that's not very. I'm not taking that. What are you talking about? Just got to get married. This is a lifetime thing. I'm more prosaic. I think your statistic is really interesting, but I'm much more prosaic than that. I know that 50% of marriages, more or less, will end in divorce. So it's the equivalent of going into a casino and putting all your money on red or black. In statistical terms, that's it. That's the reality. Everyone thinks they're exceptional. That's the fallacy. And so, what are you going to do? Well, prenups are very odd, really, because when people come to see you for prenups, they're generally completely aligned. We would like to get a prenup. And then you say, okay, fine, this is the law. And so we now need to go through disclosure process, because obviously we want this out of the way before the wedding plans, because you don't want to be doing this and trying to organise the caterers. So let's get this done out of the way, put it in a drawer somewhere. Hopefully you'll never look at it again. You start going through disclosure, and then you say, right, so what are you both going to get? Imagine this marriage breaks down. Imagine you've got a couple of kids. What's going to happen? And I would say in about 25% of cases, cracks appear almost immediately, as they both give totally different answers as to what they would regard as fair, or about financial disclosure, or about things that are a million miles away from the romance that they're swept up in. And it's that sort of lightning bolt of reality, just bringing everything down. And
So
I'm
Henry, you're
mixed feeling.
ruining all these marriages.
I know. Well, that's the thing. Or am I doing my bit to try and nudge that 50% north?
Yeah, no,
Because
couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree. And I think, as I've often said, if you can't have those conversations, because you used to have them to some extent with the church. I think the Catholic Church still do that, and I'm sure some others do.
yes,
But at least get
yes,
the couple in and have a realistic talk about,
yeah,
because sometimes people haven't even discussed whether they're going to have children or not. So I think the sort of fear of the lack of romance is just insane and delusional.
It's very funny, but
Not very helpful.
but this is the funny thing about family law, isn't it? So much of it is trying to lift the fog of delusion that surrounds the myths, societal myths of relationships, and they immediately come into conflict, because people want to believe in something. They want to. They don't. You can pick up a book on the psychology or the science of pairing. What happens in a relationship. You can be fully cognizant of the oxytocin, the different stages, where nature uses all its skills to ensure the next generation. And you don't matter. That's the reality. You don't matter. The individual does not count in that equation. But trying to get people to practically look after their future selves is incredibly difficult.
And you mentioned earlier sort of service-based and
yes.
being more service-based, and I think this is a really good example of that. I think
the
more that the law is used to help people not be delusional and put some sensible things in place, or at least to have that discussion, even if it, lots of people say, well, what's the point if it's not legally binding? But it does have standing, doesn't it? So it's like in mediation, okay, if you go to court, your mediation discussions can tend to go out the window, but that doesn't mean that you haven't had some really sensible, solid discussions. It doesn't mean you haven't made progress, and also doesn't mean you need to go to court, because you could always use an arbitrator where you could say, this is what we agreed on, we just want you to sort this bit out. So I wanted to draw you onto the LGBT plus relationships and separations, because that again it makes all these what I call extended families much more complex, because the law, I was reading once that the mediation is changing a lot now, but with the law there's a sense of two parents, but that's not true. Even if you've got I've got a couple who were married, they had two children, and one of that couple leave and marry someone else of the same sex, and then they have children. I mean, these are extended families, and they can work extremely well, but they're complicated. So if you
they are complicated. Gosh, that's huge.
From the law, what kind of area?
That's a huge area, Susie. That's huge. All right, but it's super interesting, I think. So yes, the law is branching out, and it's having to accommodate, and it's probably that way around. Lots of different communities, lots of different needs, and you've seen in what I call recent years, first of all, civil partnerships. By the way, civil partnerships, the rights are exactly the same in terms of financial claims. Now, you've seen that sort of, and that really was a bit of a stopgap for gay and lesbian couples getting married. That change came. Civil partnerships now very sort of pretty limited. But you've got, anyone now can, within reason, get married, as it should be across the community. So that's good. The complication then comes in. They are, those communities want to have the same rights, want to have equality in terms of children, parenting, but of course the terminology, the history of the law comes from essentially a traditional heterosexual family unit. And in terms of the kind of post-industrial economies, I suppose you could say that unit is the load-bearing unit in society. And that's why.
Can I just add in there, I think it's really interesting what you're saying, that the sorry to interrupt, but it just occurred to me that we talk about this, the heterosexual was the norm, but to put it in context, I think it's fair to say that it was a norm because it was about property. So women had it was males had the rights, and that's why that structure was there. It wasn't because of any genuine inherent morality, because those males were often having mistresses left, right and centre. It was simply about commerce, really, and capitalism and business.
I know. I'm so pleased you said that. Yeah,
I think it's important to mention that. I think
it's incredibly important. And in fact, one thing I would say, from an anthropological point of view, is that gay and lesbian relationships and what we would class as marriages go back hundreds, if not thousands, of years. We are not particularly advanced, and the iteration of justice that we sort of view historically is a male-based property-owning structure, which has morphed into, or tried to morph into, something with some semblance of modernity with varying degrees of success. So I couldn't agree with you more, and I would stress that. And one of the things that's quite interesting sometimes is to talk about the history of marriages and divorce, and the history of the peculiar iterations of justice that you see, and some of them very liberal from middle age, from the Middle Ages. Some of them absolutely extraordinary. But anyway, you're right to say that we shouldn't regard ourselves as being morally superior in any way in terms of our system or where we are currently. But we are kind of stumbling towards something, and I think that something is trying to be more inclusive. And I think that's what's given rise to the growth in assisted reproduction, and to go back to the beginning, surrogacy. And I think what I would say, because I knew this from my own practice, and it makes me quite sad actually that how many couples are, as I said, sorting this out in a very homespun way, because the law unfortunately cuts through their intentions when it meets dispute in a way that's unpredictable to them. Liabilities arise for donor fathers who had altruistically tried to help their friends, which is very common. Or the other way around, unwitting partners become involved in a kind of throuple situation, if I can use that appalling expression, because they didn't understand the rights that would accrue, to the child, and the way the courts would give effect to that, as various cases look at. So, what I would say to people is this: that it's a great idea. It's not difficult to do, but take advice, not necessarily from a lawyer. There's all kinds of networks out there, support networks, but just get good information on it, because it's a long commitment, and relationships do go wrong. And when there are children involved, it's very complicated and a world of pain. You can have a world of pain. So just be careful. And actually, that's something that mediation, Susie, would be perfect for. You don't need to do anything more than that, but just take some advice and look at it, and think about clinics, because this is weird for people to get their heads around. But the way the law's framed, if you have assisted reproduction through a unknown donor in a clinic, that's not only do you get the health checks for the donor, which you don't get when you're doing this via Amazon, but you also get absolute clarity on who the parents are, and the donor's position not being involved. It's too complicated, I think, probably to sensibly go through now. But there are three categories, and each of them has a different route in terms of your entitlement, your obligations, your liabilities, and that's whether you're known or unknown in terms of the donor, whether the recipient is married or in a civil partnership or just a relationship, and whether consents are given in certain situations, and whether it's done at home or in a clinic. And although that's only 6 individual factors, they all relate to each other differently. So you have a slightly exponential uncertainty. So just take some advice, and you'll be okay. But it's a lovely thing, and I think we're now seeing around 2,000 assisted reproduction births every year, probably slightly more than that, and that chart is going up and up and up. So we'll go
and it will, because for fertility, there are it does on all counts seems to be going down, and people still want to have children, quite rightly. So talking about the children there, tell me if you think I'm wrong on this, but I get the feeling that this is one area where, for all its clumpiness and lack of ability to actually enforce a lot of what it does, the legal system is trying to put the children first. But would you agree with me that society has an issue about putting the children first? So I find this, that right at the beginning with the anyone who joins my secret divorce group, for example, get a free subscription to some amazing software called Detour Life. And what it is, and I learned about that through the Amicable Divorce Network. And it's kind of a management system for the person going through divorce. But one of the first things they can do is got a template for a co-parenting plan. And I always go, yeah, put all your financial information in and all of that is all in one place. But please, please, please go through the co-parenting plan. Because time and again, people leave it till the end. And yeah, I say, look, what you agree or disagree in that plan will have financial implications. So surely you do want to do it first. But really what I'm wanting them to do is put the child at the centre of it. Because, and I've talked to mediators who want to talk to the children, not at the same time as the parents, but independently of them. And the parents will often refuse.
Yes.
They say, we know what the children want. Of course they don't, because the children protect them and won't tell them.
Yeah, no, I find myself in complete agreement. It's obviously the 89 Children Act, which is the sort of centerpiece of our legislation and family courts when it comes to children, puts children first. Ascertainable wishes and feelings of the child are at the center of everything. But does that happen in practice? Well, no, not really, because I think parents are in dispute tend to be proprietorial too often. But it's that thing, isn't it, of there being two realms in family law or family sort of disputes. There's the realm that you are subject to in terms of the law, the process, the inadequacies of the process, or the features of the process. And there's the second, which is the societal environment, your history, social history. And both of those things sort of uniquely, I think, come to bear on this. And so I think that's what makes it so complicated, because one of the things that's striking, and I'm sure you see this, Susie, is that people think that they're right. They know that they're right. And so they don't need to entertain a different viewpoint, because it's really about persuading you that they're right. What needs to happen here is that you don't understand why they're right. And if they could just explain that, then everything would be okay. And if you don't understand it, then they'll find somebody who does. So, and I do, again, I understand it. We're designed to be highly protective towards children. We've got all kinds of, mechanisms that come into play to make us fierce when it comes to protecting our children.
And I think it is that is for me, it's a bit like the guilt. I think guilt is the biggest curse of everything. Guilt makes people behave badly and often fuels anger, which is why often you'll get the parent who behaves the most obnoxiously is actually the one who did the deed.
Yes, that's so true. Yeah.
But I think with children, I think parents, it's so difficult to look at your children and think, oh my God, I could be doing this whole process could be harming them. That ironically that they can't deal with that, so they feel guilty, and often that leads to them behaving so badly towards the other parent, which of course makes it worse. And I think we just culturally, and I speak as a parent of 3, and I had to go on a steep learning curve myself, so I'm by no means innocent of not making all the mistakes that people make. But do you think that rather than talking about prenups and legal documents that may or may not stand up in law, though they can be a pretty good argument, presumably in court, they're an important addition to what was decided. So it's a lot better than going without anything.
Absolutely.
Do you think we need our co-parenting contracts where people come together and because it's mainly if they've got the children that the real issues and the long-term problems come through?
Yeah, a couple of points there. First of all, just quickly skip back to the prenups. You're right. I mean, as I say, the direction of travel is that the court will definitely try to give effect to an agreement where there's disclosure. It's been done not at the last minute, but in anticipation with legal advice, etc., etc. Yes, absolutely. That's a point well made. I think in terms of parenting agreements, certainly I encourage everyone to have a donor agreement when it comes to assisted reproduction, because I've sat with people who have unraveled in front of me in terms of the expectation of the donor, the involvement of the donor. I've had people who've said, to the surprise of the other party, well, I want the donor fully involved. I'd like them to be there at birthdays, Christmases. I'd like them to pop around whenever they like. And you can see the other parent just absolutely shocked hearing this for the first time, thinking that they were going to be creating a so-called nuclear family, and it would just be the three of them, and everything was going to be fine, and this was just a biological function, and that is confusing, difficult. So donor agreements, yes, that's extreme examples, but I think more sensibly, what is everyone going? What are the expectations of the donor? What are the expectations of the mother or the second parent? What are their expectations? Because that is literally, you can't go into those agreements unless you're broadly aligned on those key principles, because you're just creating a hell for everybody. So certainly in that situation, I think when people divorce if they're young children, I just think they're a very good idea. I think they're good housekeeping. Even if couples get on, I think they're good. I think it provides certainty for the children. And back in the day, Susie, and maybe you'll remember this, people used to stick things on the fridge, didn't they? Used to have those parenting charts that they stick on the fridge, and now everything's moved online. And, you've got access on your phone and all that sort of thing. But yeah, I do. I think it's important from the child's point of view. Going back to your point about the child being at the centre of everything, they could back in the day go to the fridge and see where they were going to be, and see what they were doing. They could see when their holidays were, and I always thought that was nice. It goes to that thing of agency, doesn't it? Which is so lacking in the family courts. Giving people agency.
And I always give people a code for a free subscription to a co-parenting app, which means there's no excuse not to use it. But also, write it up, put it on the fridge, put it on the wall, so that the child can see. And also, I think it helps then the other parent to perhaps respect it a little better, because that just becomes what the family do. But they have a way of discussing and changing it online. But what I was saying about a co-parenting contract is to have that before you get married. People are uncomfortable about the prenups. I still think they should have those discussions about money. But at the very least, have a discussion about, are we going to have children? What will happen if we break up with the children? What are and just think it through, because as people come to it and they don't even know that they're not supposed to say horrible things about the other parent in front of the children. That bit hasn't been communicated.
Yeah, it's actually. I think what's interesting about that is that prenups don't usually have anything to do with how to treat the children on divorce. I mean, it's mad for me to say this, but I really only just thought that when you said it, because we
should come up with one, Henry. We should come up with
definitely.
a template.
What a great idea. Yeah, because they don't. This is really weird and sort of, I suppose, contractually dry and transactional. That it's all to do with the money, and okay, you have departure points where you say, well, okay, we have one kid, we have two kids, the money goes this way. But no one ever says what's going to happen. Isn't that weird? Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. It's a good idea. That's a really interesting thought.
And finally, thank you so much for your time. We've talked about so many amazing things.
No, it's been an absolute pleasure. I've totally enjoyed it.
It deserves a show on their own. But I'd love to talk to you about private FDRs, because this is something that people, I think there's a lot of confusion around. And I just want to qualify it by often I'll encourage people to even avoid that if they can. And
no, you're right, because it's
only to use it on the basis that the other parent might need to have some experience of going that route before they go, okay, let's go back to mediation. Which is why it's so important to get the mediation in early, even if it's just to talk about a co-parenting plan you can't agree on, so that there's a trust built up with the mediator. Don't go in and start talking about the money, because if someone's never been, they don't know what it is. They feel more sure about court in their mind than they do about mediation, which can seem quite scary to them. But however they end up there, how does it differ from court?
Okay, good question. All right, so first of all, the private financial dispute resolution in the parlance FDR, private FDR, is a feature of financial proceedings. So you must be in financial proceedings. You must have made an application. I'm assuming in the vast majority of cases that will result in an inability to agree, a failure to disclose, something else. But you're in the court process, which is where you don't want to be, in my opinion. So the way I would my enthusiasm for it is in that context, is that, it's a bit like the old joke, I wouldn't start from here. But if you are starting from there, then that is as close to ADR as you're going to get in an environment which is going to help you settle. So why private FDR and why the emphasis on private FDR? Because you'll hear it a lot from lawyers, and it is a little bit counterintuitive. So the reason why so many lawyers support private FDR is because, frankly, the court-based FDRs are a pretty miserable experience. Court-based FDRs are where a judge, not your trial judge, but another judge, will look at your case and will hear summary arguments and will give a view, broad brush view of what the outcome might be. Will give cataclysmic advice on the costs that you're both going to incur, and through a mixture of fear and cajoling, will try to get you to sign up to or enter into either an agreement or some form of negotiation leading to an agreement. I think we all agree, no matter how I've phrased it, that is a good thing, that before going to trial, there is a stop, there is an audit, there is a view given by someone other than your own lawyers, other than your husband or wife's lawyers, somebody who's independent, coming in and saying, well, actually, I think this is what's going to happen. Why are you wasting your money? You're going to come up, not in front of me, but somebody very much like me, and they're going to do this in all probability. So, there we are. The problem is that process only has buy-in if people think the judge has read the papers. If people think the judge has heard what they have to say, seen what they've written, they may be able to live with the same outcome, but not if the judge has only had 5 minutes, hasn't read anything, is presented with a sort of a couple of summaries that, a little bit light on detail, and then comes up with a kind of, I haven't seen everything, and maybe there's more, but on the basis of what I have seen, then I think this is probably about right. But you've both got good lawyers, and why don't you go outside and talk about it? The environment is horrible. Courts are generally miserable places. Any of your viewers or listeners who've had the misfortune of going into court will know it's a horrible place. It's like a kind of run-down school building generally, with a number of rooms fully fitted with graffiti, and you get called in like a schoolboy into the headmaster. It's all very sort of nerve-wracking. You can't adequately get away from the other party because you're crammed together in a hot corridor. You're expected to negotiate in the same corridor more often than not, and it's just it's horrible, really horrible. I know. I hope I'm not over-egging it, Susie, but I think people ought to be aware, frankly. So, and let's just say, in the interest of balance, sometimes it's better than that. Some courts are quite nice. I'm thinking courts like Truro, which I used to enjoy quite a bit. It's a lovely, lovely court, won a design award. But they are mostly pretty horrible. So private FDR is completely different from that. The principle is exactly the same, but you hire your judge. So you essentially pay for a judge for half a day or a day. They're often actually judges who sit, or barristers, or solicitors who sit as judges. They have a high degree of experience, and they have plenty of time to read the papers. So you choose your forum. And that's important because you might get a district judge, deputy district judge, who's only just started, who looks, from my perspective, very young. And, it's the whole thing that, you can go to somebody who's had 20 years experience, has just been doing that day in, day out, sits as a judge. The environment is very amenable. You go to usually a fitted suite of rooms, which are air conditioned, there's breakout spaces, it's a sort of very civilized. There's time. There's time to ruminate, to put forward arguments, to be heard. It's that old thing about justice being seen to be done, isn't it? You're not going to have the buy-in unless you feel that your team has said everything that needs to be said. And then there's time if the green shoots of a solution present themselves to nurture it, to work on it, to say, well, okay, let's take this and see where we can go with it. So private FDRs, in terms of the broad sweep of the court proceedings you are inevitably in, if you find yourself in that situation, are the best option for you. They have very high strike rates as well in terms of solutions. But I also make the parallel that they are as close to ADR as you're going to get, and that is, that says something about the approaches you should think about taking. As Susie, you've said at the beginning, you don't have to start with lawyers.
And also close to ADR. But if you have managed to have even one mediation to talk about the kids, and before one of you stomped off and said, "I don't want to do it this way," knowing that there is that safe space with someone who's impartial, people don't realise this, do they? They can stop and we'll go back to mediation now. Because a lot of people think once they've started down the court route, nobody has the financial interest to tell them that, unfortunately, in the process.
Yeah,
so I'm
that's
always
true.
going,
yes.
At any point they can change their mind. You can go, look, I'm open here. You can stand in court and say, I'm still happy to go back to mediation on this.
Yes.
And I always say, make it clear to the judge that you are really happy to resolve this. You're not the one who's brought the other person.
And you know what? Judges are delighted to hear it. They really are. They most judges are overworked, underpaid. They want you to go into mediation. And also, I think, to be fair to the judiciary and the family courts, I think people know that it's not a great system. Everyone's doing their best, but I don't think it's a great system. The other point, and I think this is really important, is there is a convention in the family courts that you don't talk about money and children together. So in mediation, it's funny, isn't it? Because I'm explaining private FDR. It's all money. It doesn't matter how many kids you can have, 24 children, and I'm still just talking about money. That's the family courts you're talking about. You may say, well, obviously I need a bigger budget, or I need more bedrooms, but fundamentally, childhood is commoditized in that sense and converted into a maths issue for monetary division. What we're not ever talking about is the interests of the children per se. That sits outside the court door or in separate proceedings if necessary. But in mediation, of course, you're not tied to any of those conventions, are you? So you can have a very holistic approach, and you might find that you can, and as I said, did mediation, have been mediated. I haven't mediated recently, Susie, but because my time is so limited. But one of the funny things about it was how you could step from different areas of family life and make progress. I don't know how it works, but something about the dynamic of it, that if you switch to children.
One example is, I think, when you were talking about that, he's saying you've got to sell the house because he wants his half the house, and I'm saying he, it could be she. Obviously, it varies enormously these days. But let's say he wants to sell the house, but in mediation you talk about the children's school and where the children are, and how far away, if you sold the house, how far away you'd have to move because you won't actually have enough money to live in that area, and then he's suddenly having to travel a long way because he doesn't want to be far from his work. So suddenly talking about the children may change
his
perspective, and I think that's just one of many ways that that's why it's such a vital process. And people talk about failed mediation. I go, there's no such thing. You've been in, you've put your position, you've had the opportunity to hear each other, which is the most important thing, is to hear your other person and stop telling me what they think. I go, you don't know what they think really. Go and listen, let the mediation help you here, because you cannot find solutions if you don't do that. But going back to the FDRs, why would someone go to an FDR and follow the court route when actually they could get choose exactly the same as the FDR judge, probably also works as an arbitrator. Choose an arbitrator who's dealing, let's say, with the finances, or it could be with children matters, and they won't be there with all their barristers and all that. It's going to be a lot cheaper and quicker, isn't it? And so my question is, why would, on what occasions would you say, don't get an arbitrator, use the FDR process? Or are there any reasons why you would ever need the FDR if you could agree on the arbitrator?
Yeah, it's a great question. Okay, so the fundamental difference is to do with the function of an arbitration versus the function of an FDR, private or otherwise. The function of an FDR is to give guidance, but it's non-binding. So it's to get a view very casually. So and the advantage to that, I mean, it's pretty marginal because there's a lot in what you say, but the advantage of that is that the FDRs are privileged, so completely privileged. So, a legal term, but what that means is you can say whatever you like in terms of your negotiating strategy. You can be really lateral. You can say, well, what about if you lived in the house for a few years and then we sold it, or stuff that the trial judge might not do. And it can never be referred to again. You can't go to trial and say, yeah, well, hang on, you said that we could. So it enables people to have a huge amount of freedom in their expression to explore things. And the judge doesn't choose. The judge listens and then sort of says, well, I like that in what you've said. But I also think you've got to think, if you're going to do that, you're going to need the income to do it. And so maybe we could offset a bit of the pension here, or maybe you want to think about that as a way through, or having a review in so many years' time, or secondary education. You can have a very expansive discussion, but you can come away with it from it and think, well, I want to think about that. And quite often people do. They say, well, yeah, that's great. So I think we've made some progress, but I just need to think it through and go away and maybe take some advice from their financial advisor. And so it's more of a sort of conditioning platform, where everyone goes in, someone just listens to everything, everyone's totally free, and there it is. Whereas arbitration obviously is an underused, let's just get it right out there, underused option for people to cut through and get decisions on things that are difficult. And I think, Susie, you champion this very innovative idea of a kind of a complex and more complex compound approach to sort of sorting things out with mediation, things that you can sort out things you can't. You can have a more binary process to enable, because otherwise what happens is you lose the benefits of the mediation because you may hit a sticking point. So, and that I think is a really interesting idea, is to use arbitration for what you might call targeted problems.
Yeah, the bits that you couldn't agree on. But it's really interesting to listen to you, Henry, because you've added another layer to my strategies now, because I think you described it better than I've had anyone describe the value of an FDR. So if people really can't, if you've got someone who's just not going to listen or participate in mediation, then the next best thing is, you apply for court, but you go for private FDR, and you use that process to help let's say the difficult party, assuming there's only one, there might be two, to really think about these things. And then they've still got that option, if they can't settle, rather than go to court, they could then say, right, they may have refined their arguments before they go, perhaps use an arbitrator to give them the final deal, if they want things to happen a bit
absolutely
more.
And in fact, picking up and enthusing about your potential settlement model, you don't have to go through a first appointment. The 3-stage court process where you have the first appointment, the FDR trial, God forbid, they're the things. The process does allow, the family proceeding laws allows for compression, so that you could use a similar model. If you didn't want to use arbitration, for instance, in your mediation strategy, you could potentially design a system that short-circuited, got you straight to a private FDR, and you'd have to go through the disclosure route, I suppose. But there are ways that you could potentially think imaginatively about using bits of the system. But I mean,
that's really interesting. But disclosure is key, and that's one of the things for the Detour Life, which people who join my support group they get automatically, but also anyone who uses any of the professionals from the Amicable Divorce Network, it's there for them to use. And what the first thing is like if I'm talking to someone on an initial conversation before I introduce them to the financial planner or the mediators or for legal advice, I can get them, we can get a lot of information into there, and I can send their homework is to go away and start filling in. They can even pull in their bank statements. They can put all the documents all in one place and then they can invite the other collaborators in, so the mediator sees what the lawyers, obviously not the other half, because I rarely would it be lovely to have them in as well, but and actually it is designed to do that, and I'm like I don't think we're going to do that very often. It's going to stay one person, but so get it. I think the key thing is to get that information in first, the financial, get people thinking about putting forward proposals. I think that's the key thing, which they tend not to do. They just come to you and go, how do we split it, and suddenly you've got to work it out. I mean, do you, just out of interest, I've got two last questions for you. Do you send people off to talk to financial planners? Because most, or do you try and work it out? I've had top lawyers tell me that they say we do that ourselves. We have the software, and I'm like, okay.
No, don't do it. No, because you just don't. I mean, I can't talk about particular cases, but I just say that that I've got ongoing cases now where I don't understand. The relationship between gilt rates and annuity rates, and whether you're better off. I don't know. I mean, I would hate to take advice from.
It's long-term cash flow forecasting. That's the key
honestly,
part.
I would. It is absolutely. It is. It's an absolute skill. It'd be arrogant of me, and actually, I wouldn't take advice from myself on it. To be fair, I mean,
everyone has their skills, and they should, and work together
stick
collaboratively.
to it. So no, I couldn't agree more. And I think it's the same with pay. You would never think of, using a lawyer to work out what the division of the pension is. You'd use an actuary, because.
But they do that at the end of the process, not at the beginning. And I think that's the key thing for me, is to get all of that admin done right up front, and then it allows for everything we've talked about to flow more. But my last question is: are you going to train, or have you? Because you're collaborative law, you keep people out of court with collaborative law, and people who watch this show are amongst the very few who know what that means, because it's not very well advertised.
It's nice to be amongst friends in that case.
And you're a mediator, but are you going to train as an arbitrator?
Do you know what, Susie? I'd love to say yes to that, but I am coming to the end of my career really in the law, rather than the beginning. I've hopefully got a few years left, but I think I'm going to leave that to other, probably better lawyers to take on, and I will stay with what I know. But I wish them. I think it's the future. I think what you're doing is the future, and I think there will be a sea change eventually into the way this area of law is. It's a huge regret to be looking back over 30 years that the family courts have presided over such suffering, really.
And what do you see your role is going to be going forwards? Are you going to? I know some lawyers just do mediation and stop doing the courts, or are you just going to go and take up being a novelist?
No, I honestly don't think anyone would want to read my novels, Susie. But I think probably a little bit of gardening or something like that. But I'm not. I would hesitate. People listening to this, obviously, I have no plans yet. But I just think at this stage, I'm not saying you can't teach an old dog new tricks, but maybe there'll be younger. Oh no, forget the dog analogy. The people who are younger, who can bring more over a longer period of time than someone like me. I've maybe got 5 years or so, and I think it takes a while to learn your craft. In reality, it did with mediation, it did with collaboration, it did with law. I apologize to my clients for the first 5 years of my practice, probably, because it does take a little while. And so, to be fair to people, it probably isn't the time for me, I would think. I'll leave that to others.
Hopefully you stay what you are doing for as long as possible. But
thank you very much. Thank you.
Good. What I call the right kind of lawyers are much needed. Thank you so much, Henry.
Well, it's been an absolute pleasure. I've enjoyed it. I've probably spoken far too much, but
No, it's been amazing. Thank you so much. And I'll look forward to when anyone watching now, hopefully by the time you see this, there'll be very shortly, if not already, links to Crisp & Co. and anything else that Henry thinks you should be taking a look at. Bye for now,
Thank
Henry.
you. All right. Take care. Bye-bye.